Okay, so fresh off her Uber flat, right, is Patsy Doerr. Patsy Doerr is going to be up next. Patsy was the former global head of corporate responsibility and inclusion at Thomson Reuters. And she's going to share with us today, in having a conversation with her, she's going to share with you kind of some of the framework that they use and key factors that they use to build out a business case for and then implementing diversity and inclusion as part of their succession planning model. Just a couple of fun facts about her. She's a serious runner. She runs at least 2 marathons a year and runs them all over the world. Interestingly, she's never had a driver's license. So until this day, still does not have a driver's license. Lived in a couple different places, New York, Hong Kong, London. And what's interesting about not having a driver's license, she was part of the second class of freshmen that was on all-male college, Washington and Lee. She was the second female class in there. And she has a little bit of legacy, having left there. And that is that even though she didn't have a driver's license, she crashed 6 cars in one day. And so that remains, they still talk about her and the lady who had no driver's license that crashed 6 cars in one day. But anyway, please help me welcome the stage. Patsy, come on up. Patsy Doerr.
I'm hoping that's not the only thing I'm known for at Washington and Lee. Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you to Anthony for taking my slot wherever you are. I saw you a moment ago. I really appreciate it. I literally got in an Uber this morning that had a flat. So, and again, having no driver's license, I didn't notice it. So there was a man waiting for a car, and he goes, that car has a flat, miss. And I was like, oh, you're right. I looked at it. I go, okay, I guess I've got to book another one. So my apologies for being a bit late, but it sounds like it all worked out well. And yes, it is true. I have no driver's license. I grew up in a very small town called Manhattan. And never got it. And so, and actually, truthfully, based on the story that you just heard, it's probably best that I don't have one. In fact, my own children have told me that they will never get in a car with me because of the 6-car crash at Washington and Lee back in 1990, which is folklore now at the school. So I'm not getting it now. We're done. The chapter is over. But in any case, it's great to be here. I hope the conference has been going well for you all so far. I'm going to kind of switch gears here and talk to you about diversity and inclusion, which is my area of specialty. As Kevin mentioned, I was the head of corporate responsibility, sustainability, and diversity and inclusion for Thomson Reuters for 7 years. Without sounding self-aggrandizing, I built the function for the company. I had spent the previous 20 years in investment banking, in talent development at 3 large banks, JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank, and Credit Suisse, between New York, London, and Hong Kong. I was living in Hong Kong, working with Credit Suisse, had built the talent function for them in Asia, and got a call, as these things happen, from someone I had met a year prior to come back to the U.S. to build their diversity and inclusion function for Thomson Reuters at the time. 50,000 person firm, 100 countries, 591 cities. So no small undertaking, but I was delighted to take it on. One thing about my career is I've never taken an existing job. I always take build-outs. I'm a change agent. I like to build things from scratch. And so that grew over the years I was there. They asked me to do the same with corporate social responsibility and sustainability. So for those of you that are familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, are people familiar with them? Yes? Okay. So it's actually really interesting because without diverting too far, it really worked well for us as a framework because the Sustainable Development Goals really tie together diversity, sustainability, and what I call community investment, or CSR. And so I led those functions for the past 5 years during my 7 years there. The company split at the end of the year, lots of changes, and I made a choice I've never done before to actually go out on my own. So now I am teaching. I'm an adjunct professor at NYU. I'm speaking and I'm doing consulting primarily around diversity and inclusion, which is really where my passion lies. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And I will tell you where it started. Not only did it start from going to an all-men's college, for those of you who are familiar with Washington and Lee in Virginia, so the only Yankee, frankly, at the time who went down to the South, I was raised by a mother who, no joke, so I grew up in Manhattan primarily, but we lived in Houston, Texas for a few years. And although I'm only 29, this was back in the 70s. I don't know how this all happened, being only 29. But my mother drove, literally my father worked for Shell Oil. He's in a meeting in the 70s, not particularly diverse in Houston, Texas in the 70s. And he looks out the window as he's leading this meeting. And no joke, my mom is driving a tank across the avenue, the main avenue in Houston, Texas, for the National Organization for Women, waving a flag, speaking and yelling and all this sort of stuff. So she believed in gender equality from a very, very early age. I mean, she was born in the 1929, to be exact, actually. So I was raised by a mother who made me believe, as well as my other sisters, that we could do anything we wanted. We could be a mother, we could be a career person, we could be an athlete, we could do whatever we wanted. And that's how I've lived my life, which is take those risks, do everything you can. We don't sleep much, but to have that confidence, and I'm trying to instill that in my own children, but also, frankly, just as we build out diversity and inclusion in companies who today have a much more important role to play in this space, how do you actually instill that confidence, right, in employees, in leaders, in people within organizations? And how do you help organizations build that environment where people of all different types of diversity feel they can be comfortable and can thrive and succeed? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So a little bit on the personal side, and then we'll get into more of the business side. I'm not a big slide person, but I did create a slide deck for today, so I might veer from it quite a bit. Hopefully I can operate. Oh, there we go. Okay, so you already saw that. So what we'll talk about a little bit today is just kind of why should we care about diversity and inclusion right now? I mean, it's a very hot topic. I'll give you a little bit of background on that. How does one build an effective, diverse, and inclusive environment as a practitioner, as an HR leader, as a leader generally? I mean, I think diversity is a business, right? It's not a soft issue. It used to be seen like talent, like other aspects of HR, as we all know. I think most people in this room are practitioners. There's nothing soft about it. I mean, this is business, right? In order to be successful in today's world, you need to have a diverse talent workforce. Otherwise, you're not going to succeed. And so that's a lot of my work, which is helping people understand the business case for this. We care about it personally, but we should care about it as organizations because it is a business and it links back to business goals. And so then we'll talk a little bit about, and this gets back to the primary goals around the conference, how does this link back to the employee life cycle and succession planning, talent reviews, and things of that nature. And then happy to take any questions. So you don't just listen to me droning on for forever. Oh, there we go. Okay. So why should we care now? I'm just going to make a few comments here. I think we're all pretty aware of what's going on in the world. My role has always been global. So when I speak about diversity and inclusion, I'm speaking about it globally. So geopolitical environment, we know it's rather complicated here in the U.S. without taking a view on either side. We know it's very complicated, but we also know it's very complicated globally. There are lots of issues in the world today around diversity and inclusion and around cultural sensitivity and things of that nature. So we have to be aware of that. Clearly, rising voices and movements, right? Whether it's Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, et cetera, here in the U.S. and around the globe, even issues like Brexit, which doesn't seem like it necessarily has a direct impact on diversity, but it certainly does. So we all have to be aware of what these political issues are as we think about how we create diverse environments. And then, of course, there's increased visibility and accountability. I mean, companies are being asked so many more questions about what are they doing about diversity, right? I mean, I'll give you a stat, which is later in my slides, but as I said, I never follow my slides. At Thomson Reuters, and again, I only just left at the end of the year, so it hasn't been very long. Over the past previous 2 years, we saw an 84% increase in RFPs for business, in the number of questions our clients were asking about diversity statistics, sustainability statistics, our involvement in the community. So companies really have to pay attention to this now. It's no longer a competitive advantage to be good at diversity or even social impact from a macro perspective. It's table stakes, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you have to do it. Otherwise, you're not going to attract the talent that you want within your organization. And again, with this focus on increased transparency and having to release data, whether it's in your annual report or just through access to ESG, environmental, social governance data, platforms that are out there, it's out there. The information is there. You can't greenwash around diversity and inclusion anymore, right? So There we go. So what does it actually mean today? And I'll share my humble, which is really no longer humble, opinion based on experience. I mean, I look at diversity when we created it, and again, we built it from scratch at Thomson Reuters, as I mentioned earlier. We started in a place that, and this, I believe this to this day, that diversity is primarily about diversity of thought, style, experience, and approach, right? I could look exactly the same as someone standing next to me and have a completely different experience, a different perspective, etc. So we have to be conscious of that. I mean, clearly we care about gender, race, ethnicity, the LGBT community, disability, all aspects of diversity that we track and are very focused on because everybody has an individual story to tell. But at the end of the day, the goal is really to get the most diverse minds around the table, right? To solve problems, create solutions, and be the best that we can be. And so that's how I look at it. Without, as I said, not avoiding those very specific aspects of diversity that we need to pay attention to, but to think of it at a macro level. And that also includes a part of diversity that I don't hear a lot of, for those of you that might go to diversity conferences on a fairly regular basis, cultural diversity. It's huge. If you think about it globally, I mean, these are issues we need to pay attention to. Again, it all gets back to the best minds around the table with different perspectives. And so the demographics have expanded. The world is changing. The U.S. is changing, right? I mean, in terms of the face of leaders in our organizations and in politics all across the globe, and particularly in the U.S., we're seeing a massive shift in terms of diversity. So we have to pay attention to that. And again, I'm speaking primarily from a corporate perspective, but it's also our role and our responsibility as individuals and as consumers. Who do you buy from? You know, look at companies that you're purchasing products from. Do they care about social impact? Do they care about diversity? What does their supply chain look like? So it's an ongoing responsibility whether we're practitioners or not. Okay. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's diversity and inclusion, and then thinking more broadly at a macro level around social impact is no longer a soft issue, that's for sure. I mean, we know the data tells us, and there are a few data points here, that having an effective D&I approach or social impact approach has a direct impact on productivity, engagement, innovation, and the bottom line. We see an increase in profitability, we see an increase in stock valuation, stock prices, etc. And you can see here that organizations that focus on cultural diversity or ethnic diversity or diversity in the broader sense, frankly, are more successful. And there's so much research out there now. I mean, I get frustrated, and I'm brutally honest, for better or worse, but I get frustrated when people are still having the conversation about the business case. I'm like, really? I mean, this has been going on for years, right? I mean, we know the data's there. We can cite like 30, 40, 1,000 different research studies. It's true. This stuff is true, right? And the other thing, and I get excited about this, and maybe others don't or might, coming from investment banking, the fact that, you know, trends follow the money, right? Impact investing as an industry is on the rise. It's a $24 billion industry, rising at 17% a year. So people are now making their investment decisions on the companies they're going to invest in based on how seriously those companies take diversity and social impact. So you can't avoid it. And that's going to have a massive impact on the financial services industry, financial advisors' skill sets. You know, you have to understand impact investing. You have to be aware of those companies that are doing well. Because, and some research tells us, and I thought this was an interesting stat. Again, there's so many stats that we could cite. But by 2025, 70% of all assets will be in the hands of women and millennials. And with all due respect to all the wonderful men in this room, which I'm really glad to see, women and millennials, on average, care more about diversity and social impact. So with 70% of assets under management globally, we're talking 70 trillion US dollars in the hands of those individuals. Massive sea change on impact investing. Massive sea change on how companies need to handle these issues. So it's an exciting time. It's a little scary, but it's an exciting time because the pressure's on, and we've got to get this stuff right. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit here. I think maybe I've been talking too much. We also know that, and I think this stat's a little bit off, actually, and I made these slides, so I'll take responsibility for that. Actually, 8 out of 10 millennials make decisions on the companies they're going to work for based on their focus on social impact and D&I. So that's the population that we're targeting primarily. Obviously, it's much broader than that, but again, you can't avoid it. So we really have to be very careful because there are three factors driving companies again. It's the talent that we want to keep and the talent we want to attract, which I know is a big topic of this conference. It's our clients, as I mentioned earlier, who are now asking questions they used to not ask because they want to work with companies that have diversity strategies in place and have diverse people in place to get the best solutions. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, it's the investor community. So those are kind of the three buckets driving this effort, if you will, to pay attention to. So one of the things I wanted to talk, I'm just going to, yeah, here we go. Again, I'm not going to follow these slides very closely, but I'm happy to send any other information on after today. So in order to be effective with diversity and inclusion, in my experience, there's a number of things one has to pay attention to. And I will share with you that D&I is no different in many ways from other aspects of HR. So some of the principles that I share with you will apply to any role that you may have, whether you're in HR or a leader in some way, shape, or form, where your role involves some aspect of influence, right? But from a diversity perspective, to start with, you really need to integrate it into the entire employee life cycle. And this is where we get back to the linkage with succession planning. I've seen diversity functions fail because they over-focus on one aspect of that life cycle. So, for example, when I talk about the employee life cycle, I'm quite sure you all know what I mean, but I'll just describe it. It's everything from recruitment to development to engagement to advancement to attrition. You have to have programs, policies, measurements in place across that entire life cycle in order for it to be effective. I've seen organizations over-focus on recruitment, for example. So that's great. You bring into your organization a whole bunch of diverse people, but the culture doesn't support it, so they're going to leave anyway. So what's the point, right? So you've got to really focus on that piece of, again, not just the recruitment, but building that culture that supports it and building it into the pipeline of leadership development, not only for those individuals, but for other leaders. I mean, in our case at Thomson Reuters, which I'll use as a case study as we move forward today, one of the things that we felt very strongly about was, and you may not agree with me on this, but I'll just throw it out there. I don't believe in separate diversity training. I just don't believe in it. You go to a room, okay, be nice to women and other people, and you sign the sheet, and you leave, and you go back to your desk, and you act the same. And that doesn't work. So one of the things that we felt very strongly about is how do you actually build diversity into the leadership development curriculum overall? So if you're a leader at Thomson Reuters, you know how to build and lead diverse teams. That's just it. That's part of the deal. That's part of being a good leader. It's not some separate exercise. It's not a whole, I mean, of course I believe in unconscious bias, and I believe in all of those aspects of understanding those biases. You have to in order to be effective. But having said that, work it into the system, work it into the development programs, and hold people accountable as part of a broader leadership experience. So it's not a separate exercise. It's not this function sitting in the corner that's driving these programs and policies, but it's part of the entire organization. So the hiring, so getting back to the, okay, there we go, the employee life cycle overall, starting with the hiring piece, I mean, the key is to really think about diversity more broadly, which is what we talked about earlier. Integrate diversity into the candidate pool. So very specifically, one of the things that we did at Thomson Reuters, which I'll keep referring to, is that we made it mandatory. Initially, we started with our senior roles, and we mandated diverse slates for our senior roles. And then over time, because like any other HR or cultural change exercise, building a diverse organization takes a long time. It's a change effort. It's a transformation effort. It takes 5 to 7 years minimum, right? And so over time, we then mandated that every hire coming into the organization had to have a diverse slate. So that was great. We're really excited about that. But then we thought, hold on a second. If we have diverse slates, but we're not hiring these people, then who cares, right? So then we started tracking our conversion rates, which is holding people accountable for how many diverse people are you actually hiring. Great, you have that slate, but if you never hire one of the diverse people on the slate, then we don't care. We want to make sure that our conversion rates are matching as well. And so we built that in. And the other thing that we felt strongly about, and I continue to feel strongly about in my teaching and my consulting, is we didn't put any quotas in place. We put targets in place. It's a fine distinction, and it took us a few years to get there. But we put in place a couple years ago, and we would never have done it at the beginning of this journey. We said, look, by 2020, and this was 2017, we said by 2020 we want to have 40% women in leadership, so women in senior positions. And we had gone from 23% to 33%. I'm a numbers person, by the way, so hopefully you're not bored by these facts. But we went from 23% to 33.8% over 5 years. And then we said, in a 50,000 person company, we're going to have 40% women in leadership by 2020. So I tell you that for two reasons. Again, it's a journey. You've got to have the culture to support that so that your CEO can stand in front of all of his employees and his shareholders and say, we're actually going to do this. And secondly, you really have to be in a position where you have some goals. So I don't believe in quotas, but I do believe in having goals that you can measure against, targets that you can work towards that really mean something and that you stick to. So in terms of engagement, so I mentioned earlier the whole employee life cycle, which again applies to any aspect of leadership or HR. You want to make sure that you're creating a culture of engagement and that you're tracking it. So we also built into our engagement survey, I'm sure many of you have regular annual or biannual, right, engagement surveys. So we built in a number of different questions around diversity to understand whether our employees overall felt that we cared about it, and then cutting the data by diverse candidates as well, women, race, LGBTQ, et cetera, to see, do those individuals feel equally engaged as others? So kind of both aspects, right? Does everybody believe that we care about it? And then those populations that we're really focused on, we want to make sure that they feel included. And a lot of that is about creating a culture of communication, right? One of the things that we did do, which was part of our leadership development curriculum, was to encourage courageous conversations. I'm sure you've heard that word before, right? Because we should be able to talk about this stuff, right? It shouldn't be taboo to say, oh, I'm a woman. Oh, I'm a black woman. Oh, I'm a gay woman. I mean, or whoever I am. I mean, you should be able to, and sorry guys, I'm brutally honest and very direct. You know, I'm a New Yorker, that's how we are. We can't help it. But it's really important, I think, to be successful in this space, to have those real conversations. And that's another thing that we push, and I continue to push, which is just talk about it. Create a culture that allows people to talk about their challenges and their opportunities, because otherwise we can't address them, right? And then, of course, I mean, some of this is basic. I know you know this already, but it's important to note that education is critical to everything that we do, right? So helping people understand what is the situation as it applies to diversity within the organization, look at the stats, understand the lay of the land, look externally, understand what you're dealing with, right? Educate people accordingly. I mentioned earlier, we educated our leaders on how to build and lead diverse teams. It's just as part of our leadership curriculum, but then also hold people accountable. I mean, that's critical as well. One of the things that we were, and I recommend this, and we worked into the system as well, is that 30% of our performance reviews were focused on diversity and inclusion contributions and not attending ERG events for a cocktail. Because people say, oh, I went to like 5 events. That's really great. That's wonderful. But what did you actually do? Like, how many people have you converted? Who have you sponsored? You know, those types of things, and really, truly hold people accountable. And then if you have that in your performance management system, you can then hold people accountable financially as well, right? Through the bonus or through their salary, et cetera. So you're really, really hitting the bottom line. And then, of course, developing future leaders. It's important, of course, to focus on the senior leadership. But the hardest part, and again, not only with diversity and inclusion, as we all know, but with any change exercise, it's that kind of frozen middle, right? That's the hardest to get to, because you often have your CEO and other leaders on board, and they're all like, this is great, we love this stuff, we're on board. But then you get that middle layer who's kind of like, I just want to get the work done, right? And I'm not sure I want my person out doing A, B, or C, being a part of a business resource group or an employee resource group, or going out into their community and taking their 2 volunteer days. And you know, those are challenges. And that's the hardest group to get to for that reason. It's also the hardest group to get to, frankly, because it's usually the largest group, right? I mean, any organization, whether it's a 10-person organization or a 50,000-person organization, the middle managers take up most of the space, if you will. So just to keep focusing on educating those people and holding them accountable to targets, to goals, and as well as part of the performance management system. And then tracking progress, right? So as I mentioned at the beginning, companies are now being held much more accountable for transparency around this stuff. And there's a lot more avenues to look this information up than there used to be, right? And so it's important to track progress, be transparent about what's working, what needs improvement. One of the things I'll share with you, which I'm particularly proud about, and you're welcome to look it up or I can send information around later. One of the things that we felt strongly about in building our diversity effort and our social impact effort was we wanted to make sure that the work that we were doing was linked back to our business strategy. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Thomson Reuters, and it still exists, although it's been broken up into a couple pieces. It's a data company. We provide data, information, and news. News is basically data anyway, but we had a massive, or continue to have in the new organization called Refinitiv, a massive database that tracks environmental, social governance data on 7,000 companies around the globe, industry agnostic. And so we worked with our ESG team to develop an index, the Diversity and Inclusion Index, exciting name, which helps identify the top 100 companies out of those 7,000 in terms of how well they're doing with diversity and inclusion. And we release it to the marketplace once a year. And it serves two purposes. Number one, those companies can see what they're doing well and what they're not doing well. It is a lot of information. It's very detailed, so you can kind of dig in as much as you want and learn as much as you want. It helped us, too, see how well we were doing. And it's a good resource. But the other thing is that investors use it, getting back to impact investing, to make decisions on the companies they're going to invest in. And in fact, BlackRock actually last year launched, I'm sure you're familiar with BlackRock, they launched an ETF, so an exchange-traded fund based on our index. So it's pretty cool. So I tell you that because, A, we were pretty excited about it, but most importantly, you start to see how things like diversity and inclusion, again, traditionally seen as soft issues, are now becoming hard issues because they're meeting the bottom line. If investors are using an index that determines how well companies are doing in this space, that's pretty much the bottom line. And so there's a lot of stories out there. Bloomberg also, by the way, a big competitor of Thomson Reuters, but they also have a great index, which is primarily focused on gender, but a wonderful index that's also out there if you want to take a look at it. Because whether you're investing in the space or not, it's good to have those frameworks, right? Because they give you a framework to work with and to look at all aspects. So at the end of the day, I'll just say a couple other things. I think to summarize what it takes to build an effective D&I strategy or a social impact effort, there's 6 or 7 things. Number one, you need to have leadership support at the top, your CEO. The whole reason I moved my family back from Asia, we loved it over there, by the way. We didn't really want to come back, even though I love New York, too, and the United States, but was because our CEO cared about diversity, and he wanted me to come. He said, I want you to come build this because I want it part of our business strategy. So you need that CEO support. You need the leadership support. You need the business case. We talked about that. You need to look at diversity and inclusion. So you're looking at the culture and then bringing in the talent. You need to look at the entire employee life cycle. You need to educate people, hold them accountable, and track progress. Those are the main points summarized. And again, many of those can really apply to other aspects of a change initiative or HR generally. But that's kind of the bottom line. And I think given that I see our fine chairman standing there and it says any questions, I'm going to stop talking and see what questions you might have.
All right, questions from the group? All right, back here. Okay.
Hi, Patsy. My question is, what types of goals do you establish if you don't have anything set up yet in terms of diversity and inclusion? So where do you start in terms of goals?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I don't think there's really a silver bullet answer to that. I think, and I'm reflecting on my own experience at Thomson Reuters. The idea was to say, what's our definition of diversity, right? What do we care about? Again, as I mentioned earlier, we talked about it in the broader sense of the word, in terms of thought, style, experience, and approach, but also to focus on a particular area to start, because you want to start establishing your credibility. So again, in our case, we initially started with gender for the first couple of years, primarily because it applies across the globe pretty consistently. Race, LGBT issues, et cetera, vary quite a bit, region by region, country by country, whereas genders, obviously there are variations, but broadly speaking, it's pretty common across the globe. So we started there, and I think, So that piece, identify your definition of diversity. Start with a particular group so you establish that credibility, and make sure the business case is absolutely clear. Because despite what I said earlier, I'm sick of talking about the business case. You need to have a business case so that you can actually go out there and talk to people, particularly those skeptics who still are like, well, why are we doing this? And you have to have a clear business case. So I'd say those are the key things to start the effort. Does that make sense? Yeah, thank you. Sure.